In February 1945, the Pacific Ocean roared with the thunder of American warships. Off the coast of a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima, thousands of Marines prepared to land on terrain they had only studied from maps and aerial photographs. The air was heavy with smoke as naval guns pounded the shoreline, sending plumes of fire and ash into the sky. From the decks of their landing craft, Marines gripped their rifles and stared at the black sand beaches ahead, unsure of what awaited them. They had been told that the bombardment would weaken Japanese defenses, but the eerie silence gave no reassurance. What they could not see was an island turned into a fortress, waiting for them to arrive. The first wave of Marines surged toward the shore, their landing craft bouncing over rough surf. When the ramps dropped, they rushed forward only to be swallowed by the soft volcanic sand. Every step felt like wading through ash, draining their energy before the real battle had even begun. Bullets were not yet flying, but already the island itself resisted them. The sound of boots sinking into the grainy black ground mixed with the crash of waves and the distant echo of shell fire. For many, it was a surreal moment, as though the land itself seemed to conspire against their advance. The silence of the Japanese defenders was unsettling. Marines expected immediate resistance, a storm of gunfire as soon as they hit the beach. Instead, they found only stillness, broken by the crash of waves and the occasional burst of artillery in the distance. This absence of visible opposition felt more dangerous than an open fight. Veterans of earlier Pacific campaigns knew that silence often hid a trap, and the tension grew with every passing second. It was as though the island was holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For the men on those beaches, the contrast between preparation and reality was jarring. They had been trained for combat, for the chaos of bullets and explosions, but not for this crushing uncertainty. They dug shallow foxholes in the sand, straining to create any kind of cover in soil that offered none. Their uniforms grew heavy with grit, their mouths filled with the taste of volcanic dust carried by the wind. Time seemed to slow as they looked around, searching for enemies that refused to reveal themselves. The tension gnawed at their nerves, making every sound a potential signal of attack. Behind them, the sea boiled with more landing craft bringing reinforcements. From a distance, the sight of thousands of Marines pouring onto the beaches seemed like unstoppable force. Yet, on the ground among the choking sand and the oppressive silence, the men felt the fragility of their position. They were exposed, clustered together, with little room to maneuver. The terrain offered no protection, and every ridge looming ahead seemed to hide something sinister. It was not the resistance they could see that terrified them, but the unknown enemy concealed beneath the island's surface. As hours passed, small victories began to take shape. Marines pushed beyond the immediate shoreline, inching forward despite exhaustion. But with every advance came the growing realization that the battle would not be swift. The bombardment had not broken the Japanese defenses, nor had the landing overwhelmed them. Instead, the Marines were walking into an environment shaped to destroy them. The island was not only a battlefield, it was a trap meticulously designed by an enemy prepared to fight to the death. The early hours of Iwo Jima set the tone for everything that followed. What began with the thunder of naval fire turned into a slow, grueling crawl across shifting sand. The men quickly understood that this was not just another island to capture, it was a crucible that would test every ounce of their strength. As smoke settled over the beaches and reinforcements poured in, the scale of the coming struggle became clear. The Marines had landed, but the battle for Iwo Jima had only just begun. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima expected fierce opposition at the water's edge. In previous campaigns across the Pacific, Japanese defenders had often launched immediate counterattacks, meeting American forces head-on in desperate charges. Yet here, on the black beaches of Iwo Jima, there was only silence and the oppressive weight of waiting. Men advanced cautiously, dragging themselves through the volcanic sand, scanning every ridge for movement. For a brief moment, some dared to think the bombardment had broken the defenders. That illusion shattered in an instant. Without warning, Japanese artillery erupted from concealed positions, and the beaches became a killing ground. Machine guns hidden in fortified bunkers swept across the shoreline, cutting through advancing Marines. Mortar rounds rained down from ridges that looked lifeless only moments before. The very silence that had unsettled the Americans now revealed itself as a calculated strategy. The Japanese had chosen patience, allowing their enemy to crowd onto the beaches before striking with precision. For the Marines, the trap had closed, and the cost was immediate. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more striking. The Americans relied on overwhelming firepower, believing that naval bombardment and airstrikes could shatter any defense. Yet the Japanese had built an invisible fortress beneath the island, a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers that no shelling could touch. While Marines fought in the open, exposed to every burst of gunfire, their enemies vanished underground, reappearing only long enough to unleash another devastating attack. It was a clash not just of armies, but of philosophies of war, one rooted in mobility and strength, the other in endurance and concealment. For the Marines, the battle became a grim lesson in adaptation. They were trained to fight an enemy they could see, but here the defenders remained hidden until it was too late. Every hill, every stretch of sand became a question mark, a place where death might strike without warning. Veterans of earlier battles in the Pacific knew the Japanese fought with determination, but never before had they faced an enemy so deeply entrenched and so disciplined in their restraint. The shock was as much psychological as it was physical, eroding confidence with every step forward. As days turned into weeks, the scale of the difference grew clearer. The Japanese strategy was not to repel the Americans at the shoreline, but to bleed them slowly across the island. Every advance came at the cost of dozens of lives, sometimes hundreds, as the Marines struggled against an enemy they could rarely see. The Japanese did not need to win in the traditional sense. They only needed to make the victory unbearably costly. For the Marines, that reality sank deeper with every casualty carried back to the shore. The Marines pressed forward regardless, driven by discipline and the mission at hand, but the weight of the contrast was never far from their minds. American firepower could level a ridge, yet moments later defenders emerged from beneath the rubble, ready to fight again. It was a cycle of destruction and resurgence that made progress agonizingly slow. In this crucible, the difference between expectation and reality became stark. What began as a confident assault had become a brutal, grinding struggle against an enemy who refused to fight on American terms. The early battles on Iwo Jima revealed the depth of Japanese preparation and the limits of American strength. The clash of strategies turned the island into a nightmare for those forced to fight upon it. For the Marines, each day was another reminder that this was not a battle to be won quickly. It was a test of endurance, patience, and sheer willpower. And as the losses mounted, the cost of this contrast between open assault and hidden defense became devastatingly clear. Long before the first Marines stepped onto the black sands of Iwo Jima, the island had already been transformed into a weapon. The Japanese understood its strategic importance as a barrier between the American fleet and their homeland. Determined to make it unassailable, they began constructing a defense that defied imagination. Engineers carved tunnels deep into the volcanic rock, connecting bunkers, artillery posts, and storage chambers. By the time the Americans arrived, the island was less a piece of land and more a living fortress. It was designed not to repel invaders at the shoreline, but to bleed them slowly in a prolonged battle. The origins of this defensive strategy lay in the shifting nature of the Pacific War. By early 1945, Japan had suffered crushing defeats in previous campaigns. Direct confrontations with superior American firepower had ended in devastating losses. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese sought a different approach, one that abandoned reckless charges in favor of deliberate attrition. Instead of throwing soldiers into open attacks, they created a system where defenders could fight, vanish, and fight again. It was a grim acknowledgment of their dwindling strength, but also a demonstration of their unyielding resolve. For the Marines, these preparations came as a brutal surprise. Intelligence had suggested that the island was heavily fortified, but no report could capture the scale of what awaited them. Hidden artillery pieces could survive hours of bombardment, only to emerge intact and unleash devastating fire. Machine gun nests were placed with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no inch of ground could be taken without immense cost. The underground labyrinth meant that defenders seemed endless, as though the island itself produced more soldiers with each passing day. What looked like lifeless hills and ridges were in fact heavily armed fortresses waiting to strike. The Japanese soldiers tasked with defending Iwo Jima understood the role they were meant to play. They were not expected to survive, but to hold the Americans at bay for as long as possible. Each position they built was intended to inflict maximum damage before being destroyed. The labyrinth beneath the island was not only a tactical weapon, but also a psychological one. For the Marines above ground, every moment was marked by uncertainty, never knowing where the next shot would come from. For the defenders below, the tunnels were a shield that allowed them to fight long after defeat should have been inevitable. In this way, Iwo Jima became an embodiment of Japanese desperation and determination. It was not merely a battlefield, but a final stand shaped by months of careful planning. The Americans had prepared for another island assault, but they found themselves against a strategy unlike anything they had faced before. The Japanese transformed the natural features of the island into instruments of war, turning ridges into strongholds and sand into barriers. The origin of the struggle lay not in the clash of men alone, but in the island itself, reshaped into a weapon of defense. When the Marines finally landed, they carried with them the confidence of previous victories. But the reality of Iwo Jima's defenses stripped away that confidence quickly. The fortifications revealed themselves not in one sudden moment, but in a relentless pattern of resistance that never seemed to end. What should have been a straightforward invasion had become an ordeal. The defenders' preparations dictated the terms of battle, forcing the Americans to fight in a way that drained their strength and tested their resolve. The origins of the Japanese defense shaped every moment of the conflict. Their decision to turn the island into a fortress redefined the battle from the first shot fired to the final desperate stand. It was not only a story of men and weapons, but of how strategy and preparation could change the nature of war itself. On Iwo Jima, the groundwork laid by the defenders months earlier became the unseen force that determined the fate of tens of thousands. Once the Marines pushed inland, the reality of Iwo Jima's defenses came into sharp focus. Every inch of the island had to be fought for, often at tremendous cost. The volcanic sand that had slowed them on the beaches now followed them deeper into the battlefield, clinging to weapons, uniforms, and skin. It was difficult to dig cover, and foxholes often collapsed under their own weight. For the men advancing across the ridges, there was no comfort, no safe ground, only the constant sense that death could erupt from the earth beneath their feet. Each new position captured felt less like a victory and more like a pause before the next onslaught. The Japanese defenders made full use of their underground fortress. They would vanish into tunnels as artillery and flamethrowers raked the surface, only to emerge behind the Americans or from hidden gun ports carved into the cliffs. This cycle of disappearance and return created a sense of dread among the Marines. Imagine being a soldier who had just survived a mortar barrage, only to see the same enemy you thought destroyed reappear as if the land itself had given birth to him again. The effect was both exhausting and terrifying, stripping away any sense of progress. Weapons that had crushed defenses on other islands were less effective here. Naval bombardment had flattened the surface, but beneath the rock the Japanese remained unscathed. Flamethrowers and tanks could burn out one position, yet tunnels allowed defenders to move and counterattack from another direction. The battle became a war of attrition, measured not in sweeping advances, but in feet gained over days of relentless combat. Marines learned that progress meant clearing the same ground multiple times, often with heavy casualties. as the enemy exploited the terrain to its fullest advantage. For the men fighting on the front lines, the battlefield felt like a living nightmare. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning fuel. Explosions shook the ground, sending black sand cascading down onto exhausted bodies. The cries of the wounded mixed with the metallic clang of rifle bolts and the steady roar of machine guns. Every ridge taken came at the cost of countless lives, and each moment of silence was a warning rather than a relief. Even at night, when the battlefield was cloaked in darkness, the threat of sudden attack kept men awake and trembling in their shallow foxholes. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Units found themselves reduced to half-strength within days, with replacements arriving only to be thrown immediately into the same grinding fight. Medical corpsmen worked tirelessly, often under fire, dragging wounded comrades through the sand as bullets cut the air around them. The scale of loss was staggering, yet the Marines continued forward. Their determination was born not only of duty but of survival, as retreat was impossible, and the only hope lay in pressing onward. Every Marine knew that the only way off the island was to take it. The impact of the Japanese defenses was felt in the morale of the men as much as in their numbers. The enemy seemed endless, and the island itself felt cursed. Veterans of earlier campaigns admitted that Iwo Jima was unlike anything they had endured before. The endless cycle of attack and counterattack wore down even the most seasoned fighters. The psychological strain was immense, as men wrestled with the realization that victory would come only through staggering sacrifice. In this way, the battlefield itself became a test of human endurance as much as military might. Despite the brutality, progress was made. Slowly, ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker, the Marines pushed the Japanese back. Yet every gain carried the memory of lives lost and the knowledge that the hardest battles were still ahead. The impact of the battlefield was not measured in speed or territory, but in the sheer will of the Marines to continue despite the conditions. Iwo Jima had become more than a strategic objective. It was a crucible of suffering that demanded everything from those who fought there, reshaping the very meaning of combat for the men who survived it. As the days on Iwo Jima dragged into weeks, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Nearly 70,000 Marines were counted as casualties in the fighting, a number that shook both the military leadership and the families waiting back home. The Japanese, too, endured catastrophic losses, but their strategy had achieved its purpose. They had forced the Americans into one of the bloodiest struggles of the Pacific, draining their strength and morale in ways that statistics could only begin to capture. Each stretcher carried from the battlefield told a story of the island's brutal reality. Each letter sent home carried the weight of grief and sacrifice. The wider consequences of this struggle stretched beyond the men fighting on the ground. News of the staggering casualties reached American shores, where families listened in silence to radio broadcasts and scanned newspapers for familiar names. The battle became a symbol of both pride and dread, proof of the Marines' determination, but also a grim warning of what the road to Japan would require. For many, the thought of repeating Iwo Jima on the Japanese mainland was unimaginable. The island's defense had shown the world how deeply Japan was prepared to resist invasion, and what it would cost to overcome them. On the battlefield itself, the consequences shaped how the Marines fought. They learned quickly that traditional tactics often failed against an enemy that hid underground. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters assaults became standard practice, requiring immense courage from men who had to enter the very tunnels that had claimed so many of their comrades. The strain of this adaptation weighed heavily on them, but it also forged bonds of loyalty and endurance. The Marines came to understand that survival depended not only on their own strength, but on their ability to fight as one, supporting each other against an enemy determined to fight to the last. Psychologically, the battle was devastating. Imagine being a young Marine watching friends fall day after day while the enemy seemed to grow stronger with each loss. The sense of futility crept into every unit, whispering doubts, even as commanders urged them forward. The wider consequence was a sobering realization that victory in the Pacific would not be quick and certainly not cheap. Iwo Jima became a mirror reflecting the grim truth of modern warfare. That triumph was often inseparable from unbearable suffering. For the Japanese defenders, the consequences were no less significant. Their refusal to surrender, their decision to fight from underground fortresses, ensured that Iwo Jima would become a symbol of national sacrifice. It was proof to their leaders that even a small garrison could force the Americans into costly battles. While the island itself was lost, the example of their defense sent a clear message. Japan would fight for every inch of its homeland, and the cost of invasion would be staggering. The American command absorbed this lesson with equal gravity. Military planners saw in Iwo Jima a glimpse of what awaited on the Japanese mainland. If such resistance could come from a tiny island, what horrors would emerge in cities and farmlands defended by millions? The wider consequence was not only a recognition of the Marines' bravery, but also a chilling reminder of the price yet to be paid. The battle forced both nations to confront the full scale of what the war had become. In the end, the wider consequences of Iwo Jima were measured in more than casualties. They were seen in the faces of exhausted Marines, in the silence of families back home, and in the decisions made by leaders who understood the meaning of such sacrifice. The battle was not just another step toward victory, it was a turning point that revealed the true depth of resistance and the human cost of overcoming it. For all who witnessed it, Iwo Jima was not simply a place on a map, but a symbol of the terrible weight of war itself. After weeks of relentless combat, the moment that would define Iwo Jima arrived. On February 23, 1945, a group of Marines climbed the steep slopes of Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island. Exhausted, battered, and haunted by the sights of endless carnage, they pushed toward the summit with a single mission: to raise the American flag. The climb itself was treacherous, with loose volcanic rock shifting beneath their boots and the threat of hidden defenders still present in the tunnels below. When the flag was finally planted, it was more than a military act. It was a symbol of endurance, a moment of triumph carved from unimaginable suffering. For those on the ground, the sight of the flag lifted their spirits in a way nothing else could. Across the island, men paused in their foxholes to look up at the distant hill where the stars and stripes waved against a smoke-filled sky. Some cheered, others wept quietly, and many felt a surge of determination to keep fighting. The flag did not mean the battle was over, but it was proof that progress had been made, that the sacrifices of thousands had not been in vain. For the Marines who had endured days of horror, it was a reminder that victory, however costly, was still possible. The Japanese defenders did not surrender in the face of this moment. Their strategy had always been to fight to the last, and Mount Suribachi was only one piece of the island. After the flag was raised, fighting continued across the ridges and caves, with defenders refusing to give ground. The clash of wills reached its peak in these final weeks. The Americans pressed forward with renewed determination, while the Japanese countered with desperate ambushes and last stands that turned every bunker into a miniature battlefield. The flag may have signaled a shift in morale, but the island still demanded blood. The climax of Iwo Jima was not a single battle or a single act, but the culmination of endurance. Imagine being a Marine who had survived weeks of relentless combat, whose body ached from exhaustion, who carried the faces of fallen friends in memory, yet who continued to advance. Each day brought the same cycle, the deafening roar of artillery, the screams of the wounded, and the endless march across unforgiving terrain. Yet through it all, the men continued to fight, sustained by the belief that holding the island was necessary for the greater struggle in the Pacific. The image of the flag raising, captured in a now famous photograph, became an icon almost instantly. For the men on the island, it represented hope. For the nation back home, it became a symbol of unity and sacrifice. Families grieving their son saw in it the courage of those still fighting. Leaders saw in it the proof of American resolve. Yet beneath the symbol lay the stark truth. The battle was far from over, and the cost would continue to rise. The climax was both a moment of pride and a reminder of the suffering yet to come. By the time the island was finally declared secure, the Marines were hollowed by the experience. They had endured weeks of ceaseless combat, advancing through terrain that seemed determined to destroy them, against an enemy that refused to yield. The climax of Iwo Jima was not simply the raising of a flag or the capture of a hill. It was the realization of what victory demanded: unrelenting sacrifice, unbreakable will, and the endurance to fight on even when the body screamed for rest. It was a climax carved not from glory alone, but from the agony of thousands who gave everything on that black volcanic rock. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the island stood as a wasteland of blackened earth, shattered ridges, and silent bunkers. The Marines had secured their objective, but the cost was almost beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands of men lay dead or wounded, their sacrifice etched into every inch of the volcanic soil. The victory was undeniable, yet it carried the heavy weight of grief and exhaustion. For the survivors, leaving the island did not mean leaving the memories behind. The cries of the wounded, the smell of smoke, and the sight of comrades lost would remain with them forever. Back home, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a powerful image that defined the American experience of the war. Newspapers and newsreels carried the photograph across the country, and it quickly transformed into a symbol of unity, resilience, and sacrifice. Families mourning their sons found some measure of solace in that image, believing their loss had contributed to something greater. For the nation, Iwo Jima was both a victory and a solemn reminder of the price paid for every advance. The legacy of the battle was not one of triumph alone, but of sacrifice carried by an entire generation. For the Japanese, the defense of Iwo Jima became a testament to their determination to fight to the last. Though the island was lost, the resistance proved to their leaders that even a small force could inflict staggering casualties on the Americans. It reinforced the belief that defending the homeland would require every citizen, every soldier, to endure the same kind of struggle. The legacy of their sacrifice was tied to a national resolve that refused to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The defenders of Iwo Jima became symbols of a spirit willing to fight until the end. In military history, Iwo Jima has endured as a case study in both courage and cost. For the Marines, it was a crucible that tested their discipline, unity, and resilience. The lessons learned on that island shaped how future battles were fought, highlighting the need to adapt to an enemy who would use every natural advantage. The island itself became a symbol within the Marine Corps, a reminder of the endurance required when facing impossible odds. Every Marine who stepped onto Iwo Jima carried with him a piece of that legacy, whether he survived or not. The closing chapter of Iwo Jima is not written in statistics alone, but in the faces and stories of those who endured it. Imagine a young Marine, barely 20, returning home with scars both seen and unseen, trying to explain what it meant to fight on that island. Imagine the families who received letters instead of embraces, holding photographs instead of sons. The legacy of Iwo Jima rests in those moments of personal sacrifice magnified across thousands of households. It is a reminder that history is not only about battles won, but about the human lives forever changed by them. Today, Iwo Jima remains etched into collective memory as both a victory and a warning. The iconic flag raising endures as a symbol of courage, yet beneath it lies the shadow of immense loss. The island tells a story of what it means to endure, to sacrifice, and to fight when no easy path exists. Its legacy is one of solemn respect, not just for those who captured it, but for all who faced the unimaginable there. In the end, Iwo Jima is remembered not only as a battlefield, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the darkest hours of war.